The 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq happened rapidly. Although Iraq was not involved with the September 11th attacks, the fear generated from the attacks was used to promote a U.S. invasion of Saudi Arabia's longtime enemy, Iraq. The lies and manipulation used by the Iraq war lobby are now widely known. Yet, the propaganda for a new war in the Middle East continues.
In the lead up to the Iraq war, the different players you could call the Bomb Iraq lobby employed a lot of tactics that, frankly, we're seeing these days with regard to Iran. One of the primary elements of it was just the fear-mongering that you would see at any time, issuing lots of reports, making it seem like Saddam Hussein was a much greater enemy than he was. Remembering Ahmed Chalabi is a very important thing to do as we look at what's going to happen with Iran. He formed something called the Iraqi National Congress, which he presented as being a top, vibrant opposition group that would be ready to just parachute into Iraq and become a new government. He seemed to be all set to bring in a mass of people, have a kind of the domestic rising of democracy that he could lead, and so it would just be easy. Invade Iraq, take Saddam down, hand it over to Chalabi, you're good to go, focus on what your next steps are. And, as it's been seen, it was just absolutely not the case. Chalabi was a fraudster, had gotten in trouble with the banking regulators in Jordan, had minuscule amount of support within Iraq, and then the news broke eventually that he was actually feeding intelligence to Iran. So not exactly a win. We have to be concerned about that now because there is a parallel group with regard to Iran called the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, also known as the People's Mujahideen of Iran. I'm going to call them the MEK. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq is an Iranian dissident group that over time became a cult, was on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list for many years until it was recently removed. And its interest is in becoming the new government of Iran. An interesting connection between the MEK and Ahmed Chalabi here, because some of the very same people who have been advocating on behalf of the MEK were advocating on behalf of Ahmed Chalabi. And through some of the reporting done by Ali Gharib, who is at one of the editors at Open Zion at the Daily Beast, actually found the specific address where the same people are advocating on behalf of both of them with the specific interest of more military action in the Middle East.
Media manipulation is a propaganda tactic used by war planners across the globe. This graph was leaked to the Associated Press as proof that Iran was developing nuclear weapons. It was quickly pointed out to the AP that the graph can be found in textbooks used by nuclear engineering students. It was the National Iranian American Council that led the effort to debunk the bogus graph.
In the AP case, it was so blatant, and it was so reminiscent of what happened in the Iraq War, in which, the most fanciful stories were being thrown out there. So that we immediately organized an action alert, and we started bombarding AP with demands for a retractment of that story, which led to a second story by them in which they were bringing in a lot of the critical voices against that story, which was a way for them to apologize without coming across as they really apologized. But what it really did is that it did not permit that one story to find legs. Because what happens is that you have one fanciful story, but then when 10 other news sources are quoting that, and 10 other are quoting the second, then suddenly it has a life of its own, because there's like tons of news outlets that have been quoting the same thing, so it must be true. And then suddenly it's become a truth. Then you have to disprove that truth, which is much, much tougher. Essentially that story has gotten a life of its own. This story was never permitted to get a life of its own. It was pointed out very quickly, efficiently, forcefully, that this is fanciful, there's no real basis for it, and it died. And you're not seeing any news stories quoting that any longer because we killed it.
This type of coverage and this type of media coverage and the political attention is completely selective and is based on strategic needs of the empire. Since Egypt is in Washington's pocket, since Saudi Arabia is in Washington's pocket, no attention and no censorship is required of those regimes. Since Iran is independent and outside the scope of the U.S. orbit of power, it is to be punished. Its transgressions are to be highlighted.
How important is a free and independent media?
Well, depends whether you care about democracy or not. If you want a democratic society, you're going to have free and independent media. The concept of objectivity is well defined. If something's being debated in Washington and you report one side or the other accurately, you're being objective. If there's something outside the framework of what is commonly accepted in the state corporate system, you're being biased and opinionated, and it's not serious. Well, okay, that's a terrific system for a well-functioning totalitarian state. Keep within the framework of the power centers and present opinions accurately on both sides. That basic framework is stultifying, and it means that lots of things are simply dismissed as not disinterested, not objective, biased, and so on. And there are often things that are right at the center of what people ought to know. A free and independent media wouldn't accept those constraints.
The most extraordinary thing I find in my trips to Iran is how pro-American the Iranian people are. I've never seen anything like this in all my travels in my life. When I was last there, I was standing on a street corner in Shiraz, and somebody came up to me, and we were waiting for the light to change. This asked me where I was from, and when I said America, there was shrieking, and within a couple of seconds I was surrounded by about 8 people. And one woman said to me, "We know they say terrible things about us over there, but we love America so much." You don't even get that in Canada. This is unique in the world. They have an exaggerated, over-idealized view of the United States, and it's quite remarkable considering the circumstances.
The Iranian people definitely do not want a war. It would be the most horrifying thing that can happen to them. They still have very fresh memories of the war with Iraq. As I said, Iranian cemeteries all over the country are filled with the youth who died in the war.
There's a tremendous frustration in Iran, I think, among many people, that the country has fallen so far short of its potential. Nonetheless, there aren't very many people in the world who truly believe that you can bring democracy to a country by bombing it. I guess there still are some people who believe that in Washington, although our last few attempts haven't been so successful. I truly believe that democracy can take hold anywhere, but I think there are 2 important conditions. One condition is it takes time. Democracy is not just an election. Democracy is a whole way of dealing with life's problems. It takes years and decades and generations for people to adopt this mindset. Actually, Iran is one of the few countries in the Middle East where people have had this time. They had their constitutional revolution more than 100 years ago. All during that time, they've had a constitution, they've had elections, they've had a parliament. The elections haven't always been fair, and the parliament has been restricted, but they have an idea of what is a political party, how do you vote, what are the institutions of government. So Iran qualifies on point 1. The second thing I think that you need to have a country develop democracy is that the people in the country have to want it. Western-style electoral democracy is probably the most democratic system for us in the United States. It doesn't work everywhere else because people have different cultures and different backgrounds. I think that Iranians have gotten to the point where this is what they want, but they have not gotten to the point where they think they can get it through a war.
I have no doubt that democracy will come to Iran very slowly, gradually, but it will be grassroots. And if there is a war, that's going to be delayed for a very long time. That's why a war is scary.
People told me in Iran, every time there's a provocative or hostile statement coming out of Washington toward Iran, the leadership in the country turns the screws on the democratic elements saying, you're enabling this. You two are connected. The pressure we're getting from the United States is directly, connected to what you're doing inside the country. So it actually undermines the possibility for democratic change in Iran.
I've often reflected on this question. I've asked myself, since engaging with Iran and trying to build up civil society in Iran and trying to establish trade with Iran, not pushing Iran into a corner and sanctioning it and hectoring it all the time, but trying to bring it into regional security arrangements, might produce a strong, stable, nationalist, democratic Iran. Therefore, why are we not doing that? And I think the logical answer one would give is, we don't agree that that's what it would produce, or that's not possible. But I do ask myself sometimes this question. Couldn't there be some people in Washington who would think, strong, self-confident, stable, prosperous, democratic Iran, is that really good for us? Maybe miserable, unhappy, poor, backward, isolated Iran is better for us. I hope people are not making that calculation in Washington, but I fear at least some are.
It's not just about oil and natural gas. It's also about hegemony and control and vengeance. Punishing Iran for overthrowing a very close ally of the United States. The Shah of Iran was like a cash cow for the U.S. military-industrial complex. He was buying billions and billions of dollars of weapons. And so they've never forgiven Iran for overthrowing the Shah and the Islamic Revolution. And that's also part of the equation, to restore a compliant, servile, subservient regime in Tehran that will answer the bidding of Washington. So when American presidents, be they Obama or Bush or Reagan or Kennedy, say that the United States is committed to democracy, the red flag should go up in the citizen's mind. Wait a second. What about democracy in Chile? Wasn't that a democratically elected government? Wasn't Salvador Allende elected? Didn't the CIA destroy democracy in Chile and in other countries as well? Aren't we supporting a homophobic, misogynistic, feudal dictatorship in Saudi Arabia? The U.S. is clearly not committed to democracy. It has set up a protectorate in Afghanistan. It's almost, again, it's risible. You have rigged elections, bought votes. The puppet there, his name is Hamid Karzai. He's, I think, a former Unocal oil consultant, may have been also a CIA asset at one point. He's one of the most corrupt leaders on earth. In Iraq itself, we have been the handmaidens to a new dictatorship there, basically Shia-based, led by al-Maliki. So clearly we're not spreading democracy, we're actually limiting democracy.
What's public opinion in the Arab world? I mean, that would seem to be important. In fact, it's crucial. In fact, it is crucial. And the planners certainly know about it, even though there's been no reporting in the press. Although the facts are well known, their polls are taken by the major U.S. polling agencies, released by prestigious institutions and so on. But the media sit on them. They're not, if you bring them up, you're not being objective in the technical sense. What they show is that if there were authentic democracies in the region, that is, political systems in which public policy reflected public opinion, that's what democracy is supposed to be, the United States not only wouldn't control the region, it would be excluded. The main non-Arab power in the region is Turkey. Turkey refuses to go along with U.S. policy. In fact, it's improving its relations with Iran. It's just announced a tripling of trade. It opened a new pipeline. They're natural trading partners. Brazil, which is the most admired country in the South, is also quite supportive of, they don't like Iran's internal politics, but in the conflict, they tend to support Iran. I think the United States is wrong. Along with Turkey, they've tried to broker an independent solution to the uranium enrichment problem. The U.S. shot it down very quickly. The non-aligned countries, it's most of the world, have vigorously and repeatedly announced their support for Iran's right to develop nuclear weapons. I mean, that's the world. We may say the world is wrong if we like. Okay, we can say that. But we ought to know that the United States is isolated, very isolated, and to carry out it's isolated even of its present policies of threats. The threats, incidentally, are in violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares. But even the threats are extremely unpopular. An invasion would just be a horror story.
At some point, there's going to have to be a fundamental break where both sides do something to demonstrate that they are serious and that there's a real possibility here. And so what does that end agreement look like? I don't know what it all looks like, but it probably looks like Iran's going to be allowed to enrich either nationally or multinationally. That would be my preference, 3 to 5%, but with constraints. That Iran's going to be much more transparent. Forward-leaning transparent rather than reluctantly transparent, that it's allowed to settle up its past mistakes. I mean, Iran had a bomb program. I believe that it had a bomb program that it stopped in 2003. Now, we don't have to cross every T and dot every I to find out exactly what happened, but we have to settle up on that somehow. You know, and for its part, the U.S. has to make clear that if Iran does these things, you know, stops producing 20%, doesn't stockpile 20%, is more open and transparent, well, that the U.S. is going to remove sanctions. And I think there's a real question whether that's going to happen or not, because I can easily imagine U.S. Congress saying, after Iran goes through a series of steps, does what it's supposed to do, and then Congress is asked, please remove these sanctions, and I can imagine Congress saying, no, we're going to keep them and we're going to add more. Well, you know, that's not going to work either.
I think that the situation has changed. There is no neocon rhetoric, and hopefully there will be a chance for negotiations. Unfortunately, the sanctions are not helping.
What would you like to see come out of the Obama administration in the coming months or years?
I think what would be really needed from the Obama administration is to invest in the type of diplomacy that can succeed. Limited diplomacy cannot succeed. Instantaneous diplomacy cannot succeed. It has to be the type of diplomacy that is patient, that is long-term, that is broad in the sense of not just talking about the nuclear issue. We have to talk about human rights. We have to talk about regional issues. I think that would be extremely valuable. I understand the difficulties that the administration is facing with, one of them being that it would be very politically risky for them to go down that path and spend political capital on that issue if there's no indication that the Iranians would do the same thing on their end. If the Iranian government is not coming to the table with the same determination, with the same persistence and patience, then it could be a waste for the administration to challenge the forces of status quo in Washington by going down that path. But ultimately, I think this is an issue that is sufficiently important, has such a significant strategic value for the United States, that this is something that we have to consistently pursue. Absence a resolution to this issue, I don't think we are in a status quo that is motionless. The status quo has a motion, and that motion is a steady gravitation towards a military confrontation.
You know, the U.S. and Iran don't have diplomatic relations, and which I think is a problem. You know, you don't need to talk to your friends. They're your friends. You need to talk to your enemies. And not because you're being nice to them, not because it's a reward, but because it's smart foreign policy. So they know exactly what you mean when you say something, and they don't have to decipher tea leaves or have people whisper in their ear or interpret what your meanings are. You can have direct face-to-face exchanges. We had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. We had diplomatic relations, you know, with China. We've had diplomatic relations with, you know, virtually all our enemies except Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. And I think that just doesn't make any sense, sheerly from a self-interest practical standpoint.
I think the best outcome that we could achieve, and I'm not saying this is the realistic outcome, but the best outcome would be one in which the US and Iran have a bilateral. In that bilateral, they talk about regional issues as well as human rights and the nuclear issue. We managed to resolve the nuclear issue going for the most logical conclusion there is, which is Iran has to accept full transparency and limitation to its nuclear program. and the US will accept that there will be enrichment in Iran below 3.5%. And that the Iranians will sign the additional protocol and have all of those transparency and verification processes in place. If that can be done, then hopefully there can also be an addressment of the regional issues that are causing so much instability. And if we can then reduce all of those tensions, I think it will open up the space inside of Iran to be able to give breathing room for the pro-democracy movement. And then they can do what they can do much better than we can do, which is to change Iran from inside in a much more positive, liberal, open, democratic direction. That would be the most pleasant outcome. Will it be taking place in this rather neat way that I explained? Most likely not. But it is achievable. It may take much longer. And I think it's critical that the US puts human rights on the agenda so that we don't just strike a security deal as we have done in that region for so many times, but also recognize that the human rights issue is a strategic component. It's something that enables relations to withstand time, to be able to endure, because there's something more than just short-term security needs and interests that are the foundation of a relationship.
I think it's reasonable to suspect that Iranians could have some grudges against the United States. After all, look around what's happening in Iran right now, and many people could spin out a tale under which this wouldn't be happening at all. We might have been living under a free country had it not been for the United States coming in and crushing our democracy. So given all of this, why is there such a strong pro-American feeling among many Iranians? I wouldn't say it's universal, but it's probably at least as widespread as anywhere else in the world. First of all, I think a lot of time has passed since the Mossadegh episode. Generations have passed. The great hopes that many Iranians had for the revolutionary regime have not been realized. In addition, I think the United States does represent a beacon of hope, not just to Iranians, but for many, many people around the world. It's always remarkable to me to understand this. Despite all of our sins in the world, the United States is still a place that many people in the world admire. They admire the fact that we have a measure of freedom, that we have political stability, that we have some kind of predictability of life. And as I've heard many times, it's a country where if you work hard, you can get somewhere. People admire the opportunity that is available in the United States. I have to think that if Israel were not as concerned about Iran, the United States would not be as concerned about Iran. If for some reason the Israelis would decide tomorrow that they don't care about Iran anymore and they have a fine relation with Iran, I think all the air would go out of the anti-Iran bubble in Washington very, very quickly. You don't have to take this in a cynical way. It may be that there are people in Washington who take Israel's strategic calculations very seriously and want to be wherever the Israelis want them to be. But whether or not that's the case, or whether there are more political reasons for it, the fact is that pressure from Israel is a dominant driving factor in the intensity of the anti-Iran feeling in Washington. You wouldn't have this depth of emotion if there weren't something else driving it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have so many people who cannot find Iran on a map so eager to bomb it. On my last visit to Israel, I heard a private talk from one of the senior Israeli security figures, and he made clear that nobody in the Israeli security establishment really believes that Iran would use a nuclear weapon to attack Israel. He said, we allow this impression to be given because it sounds like it's logical, although those of us that are journalists are always trained to remember that something that looks logical and makes perfect sense might not be true. But he said there's two other reasons why we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It's not that we think they're going to bomb us, because they know this will result in their instant liquidation as a state, and they are not that suicidal. But first of all, this Israeli official said, we're worried about an arms race in the region. Saudi Arabia will want a nuclear weapon, then it's going to be Turkey, then it's going to be Egypt, and pretty soon we really have trouble. And secondly, he said, when you have a nuclear weapon, you don't have to use it. That's the beauty of it. You can intimidate people by having it. And the Israelis probably have some experience with that. So I actually, from my conversations in Israel, including with some people that are in positions of authority, I conclude that the Israelis don't really fear that an Iranian nuclear weapon would result in the liquidation of Israel. They fear that it would result in the strengthening of Iran, and that alone is enough for them to be against it. This is a country where people have been living for thousands of years within more or less the same boundaries, speaking more or less the same language. It has a tremendously rich cultural and political history. It is not a country for the outside world to take lightly and think that we can just push them around like some tiny little African republic or Central American dictatorship. This is a country that not only has a strong sense of itself, but has a great deal to contribute to the world. I hope the world can arrange a relationship with Iran so that Iran can emerge from its isolation and share this richness with the rest of us.